This is lecture number 45 in the ABCs of Communism series, and it will be chapter 62 in next year's ABCs of Communism Bolshevism 2017 when you get it. Last time we were talking about Chile, and I have gone over Argentina a little bit before in the previous lectures on Argentina, so the first 7 pages of this chapter are actually a rehash of much of that, and I won't do it now. I'm going to start with the material that's on page 7 for those of you who are going to be using the text. And I want to just make a couple of preliminary comments. So for those of you who haven't seen these previous lectures or haven't read the book, you'll recall, or you should know, that Juan Perón, President of Argentina, was the #1 State Department enemy of the United States before 1948, and I only make that point because after 1948 the CIA took over the conspiracy to destroy the Argentine government, and but it was an old pattern that has been going on for a long time, and it goes on to this very day, which brings us to the next comment, and that is, now you've seen that the U.S. has been involved nonstop in attempts to control Latin America throughout the entire 20th century, and in the post-World War II period has been constantly at war with the progressive forces in Latin America, and everywhere the CIA has been the main operating agency, and it has its function has been to establish fascist regimes wherever possible. Now, we went through a period recently, the last 20 years, where much of their work was undone as revolutionary forces in South America got the upper hand. But they're back on the attack again. This time they're going to be harder to stop because right now the future of the world is being decided in South America. Not in the South China Sea, not in Syria or the Ukraine or the Baltics, because everywhere else the U.S. has been blocked. It's been stopped in Europe, it's been blocked in the Ukraine, it's been blocked in Syria, and the Chinese are blocking it pretty effectively in the South China Sea. The only place that they correctly see that they might have a chance to regain some of their previous positions is in South America, so that's what they're doing. And right now, #1 target is Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Venezuela. Well, they have control of Argentina and and Brazil and Paraguay at the moment. Although, in the case of Argentina and Brazil, that control is very tenuous and has every possibility of being destroyed within the next year or two. They have control completely of Peru. They even put a U.S. citizen in charge as president of Peru, a guy named Kuczynski. And of course he has appointed an entire neoliberal cabinet, exactly what the embassy wants. We're going to hear more about this man, Harry Schlotterman, later on because of his involvement in Argentina. But when I was down there, Schlotterman was a U.S. ambassador to Lima, Peru. He was a career CIA agent inside the State Department. And he, I'll have to say, had his hands full between trying to run a complete idiot, an alcoholic drug addict named General Morales Bermudez on the one hand, and me on the other. It wasn't an easy 3 years for him, but now they've got a new guy named Brian Wilson, I think. He's also a career CIA agent as a U.S. ambassador to Lima, and he's done a much better job. He's probably had a much easier time of it. Kuczynski certainly would be a lot easier to control than Morales Bermudez was, and as far as I know, they don't have any other Americans in prison down there that could give them very much trouble. So to sum this up, the situation is this: the CIA has made real headway in Peru, Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil, but all of those are in question. Now, we want to go back to 1976 when the CIA's Operation Condor had centralized information from all of the South American intelligence agencies. Condor 1 was at its height. Chilean exiles in Argentina had to go into hiding or seek refuge in a third country, as CIA agents were actively hunting and killing them. Chilean General Carlos Prats had already been assassinated by the Chilean DINA, D-I-N-A, in Buenos Aires in 1974, with the help of CIA agents Michael Townley and Enrique Arancibia. Cuban diplomats were also assassinated in Buenos Aires in the infamous Automotores Orletti torture center. Automotores Orletti was one of the CIA's 300 clandestine prisons managed by a Grupo de Tareas 18. Grupo Tareas was headed by Anibal Gordon, an armed robbery felon who answered directly to the General Commandant of the SIDE, Otto Palladino. Furthermore, Automotes Orletti was the CIA's main base of its Operation Condor. One of the survivors of that torture center was Jose Luis Bertazo, who was detained for 2 months there. He later identified Chileans, Uruguayans, Paraguayans, and Bolivians among the prisoners. CIA men and agents from their countries interrogated these captives there. Chilean prisoners in Orletti Center told Jose Luis Bertazo that they had seen 2 Cuban diplomats, 22-year-old Jesus Cejas Arias and 26-year-old Crescencio Galeñega, tortured by Gordon's group and interrogated by a CIA agent from Miami who came one day to interrogate them. These 2 Cuban diplomats were assigned to protect the Cuban ambassador to Argentina, who was Emilio Aragones at the time. He had been kidnapped, or they were kidnapped, on 9th of August 76 at the intersection of Calle Arebeños and Virrey del Pino by 40 armed CIDE agents who did the kidnapping, and they blocked off all of the street with their CIA-supplied Ford Falcons. The FBI, as well as the CIA, were informed of their abduction, and we know this from multiple sources, including a man named Robert Dingus, who, in his book published a cable sent by Robert Scherer, an FBI agent in Buenos Aires on 22 September 76, who states that a CIA man, Michael Townley, was one of the kidnappers. Townley had also taken part in the interrogation of the 2 Cubans, and you'll recall that Townley was later convicted of the assassination on the 21st of September of 76 of former Chilean minister Orlando Letelier in Washington, D.C., and the former head of the DINA confirmed to Argentine federal judge Maria Serini de Cubría on 22 December 99 in Santiago de Chile the presence of Townley and Cuban Guillermo Novo Sampol in the Orletti Center. These 2 men came from Chile to Argentina on 11 August 76 and cooperated in the torture and assassination of the 2 Cuban diplomats. Luis Posada Carriles, currently in witness protection in Gringolandia, boasted in his autobiography Los Caminos de Guerrero, The Roads of War, of the murder of the 2 young men. According to the terror archives discovered in Paraguay in 1992, 50,000 people were murdered by U.S. Condor agents. Furthermore, Gringo agents disappeared somewhere between 9,000 and 30,000 and incarcerated 400,000. False flag actions by CIDE agents included, during a 1981, it was revealed that the CIA in 2000, through its CIA DINA agent Michael Townley, reported that Ignacio Novo Sampol, a member of the CORU, C-O-R-U, anti-Castro terrorist gang, had agreed to commit his outfit to Buenos Aires' kidnapping of a Dutch bank president. That abduction was organized by the Argentine intelligence agency SIDE, S-I-D-E, for extorting a ransom from that bank. Townley said that Novo Sampol had provided $6,000 from his Cuban terrorists and forwarded it to the CIDE to pay for the preparation expenses of the kidnapping. After returning to the U.S., Novo Sampol sent Townley a stock of paper used to print pamphlets in the name of the Grupo Rojo, Red Group. This non-existent Argentine Marxist terrorist organization was to claim credit for the abduction of the Dutch banker. Townley declared that the pamphlets were distributed in Mendoza and Cordova at the time of false flag bombings. Bombings actually perpetrated by CIDE agents, since Grupo Rojo did not exist. They wanted to give it some kind of accreditation, and the CIDE procrastinated too much, however, and that particular kidnapping finally was not carried out. Now, atrocities of the CIA imposed dictatorship from 1976 to 1983 have been widely reported by CAP sources as well as progressive sources. On the 5th of January of '79, the New York Times published an article by David Vidal. In it, he claimed that the number of disappeared in Latin America now numbered 30,000. The Christian Science Monitor and Boston Globe followed suit with similar articles claiming that 30,000 people had disappeared under military dictatorships in Latin America. The Los Angeles Times repeated the claims of 30,000 Latin Americans disappeared in a new article in October and November of that year. And in May 1980, the Montreal Gazette, in an interview with the sister of the slain guerrilla commander Ernesto Che Guevara, Cecilia Guevara, said that in Argentina alone more than 30,000 people had disappeared and another 15,000 had been imprisoned. You'll recall that Che Guevara was originally from Argentina. On the 10th of December 1983, Raúl Alfonsín assumed the presidency in Argentina. 1 week later, he established a commission to investigate the disappearances of what he believed to be more than 6,000 Argentines, at least, in nearly the 8 years of military rule. What he created was called the National Commission on the Disappearance of Persons, CONADEP, CONADEP, and it researched and recorded case by case the disappearance of about 7,158 persons. Argentine human rights groups maintained that 30,000 disappeared. Official Argentine records initially put the number of disappeared at 13,000. An estimated 15,000 people disappeared in Argentina, according to Human Rights Watch in their 2002 report. And you know HRW, Human Rights Watch, is a heavily CIA-infiltrated organization. Other groups, such as Amnesty International, were gravely concerned by the state's use of disappearances and periodical use of extrajudicial killings against what were supposed to be subversives in the last months of the military junta under Lieutenant General Reinaldo Mignone. Amnesty International estimated the total number of disappeared in Argentina to be 15,000. Trade union members and students, including young students, were primary targets. For example, in September '76, during the Night of the Pencils, an operation directed by Ramon Camps, general and head of the Buenos Aires Provincial Police from April '76 through December '77, killed himself 1,000 kids. Murder for profit targeted people who had uncovered evidence of government corruption. Suspicious people thought to hold left-wing views, such as the French nuns Léonie Duquet and Alice Dumont, were a large target group also. Alfredo Astiz kidnapped the nuns. Many of these were sent to Paul Schaefer's Colonia Dignidad, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Ramon Camps told Clarín in 1984, that's a newspaper, that he had used torture as a method of interrogation and orchestrated 5,000 forced disappearances. He further justified the appropriation of newborns from their imprisoned mothers because, he said, subversive parents will raise subversive children, quote unquote. Quote. Many of the disappeared were pushed out of planes and into the Rio de la Plata or the Atlantic Ocean to drown. These forms of disappearance, theorized by Luis Maria Mendia, former chief of naval operations in 1976-77, who is today being tried for his role in the ESMA case, that's the naval prison, are called vuelos de la muerte, death flights. These individuals who suddenly vanished are called desaparecidos, meaning the missing ones or the vanished ones. This term often refers to the at least 30,000 Argentines that went missing. Tomás de Tofino, Deputy Secretary General of Luz y Fuerza de Córdoba, was kidnapped on the 28th of November 76 and executed at a military prison camp in Cordova on the 28th of February 1977, 1 year later, in a military ceremony presided over by General Luciano Benjamin Menendez. In late December 76, 22 captured Montoneros suspected in the death of General Cáceres Mone in the attack on the Argentine Army 29th Mountain Infantry Regiment were tortured and executed during the massacre of Margarita Belén. These murdered guerrillas were killed in Chaco province. Videla, General Videla, who was to be president, would be found guilty of these homicides during the 1985 trial of the juntas. Convicted with him were Cristino Nicolades and junta boss General Leopoldo Galtieri and Santa Fe Provisional Police Chief Wenceslao Siniquel. The victims' relatives uncovered evidence that some children from their mothers soon after birth were being raised as the adopted children of military men. One case is that of Silvia Quintela, a member of the Montoneros guerrilla movement. For 3 decades, the mothers and grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, a group founded in 1977, has demanded the return of these kidnapped children, numbering at least 500. 77 of these kidnapped children have been located so far. Now, fighting back, on the 28th of January 1977, Montoneros planted a bomb in a suburban police station, killing 3 cops and wounding at least 10 others. On the 18th of February 77, left-wing guerrillas bombed a crowded bus in Buenos Aires, and several civilians suffered severe burns in the attack, and on the 26th of March, they bombed the ground floor of the Sheraton Hotel in Buenos Aires, wounding a Spanish tourist and 6 hotel employees. On April 5th, the Montoneros detonated a powerful bomb inside the building housing the Argentine Air Force headquarters located in Buenos Aires. And on 11 April, Montoneros guerrillas shot and killed Luis Liberato Arce of the Surrey Company, an air conditioner maker. On the 7th of May, the Montoneros mortally wounded Vice Admiral Cesar Augusto Cusetti of the Argentine Navy. On the 30th of July, 6 left-wing guerrillas were killed in a shootout with security forces in the La Plata suburb of Buenos Aires, and a kidnapped executive, Roberto Leon Lanciota, was freed. In 1977, 36 policemen in Buenos Aires alone were assassinated or killed in action with left-wing militants and guerrillas. In September of 77, General Albano Arguindegui, Minister of the Interior, admitted that in May of that year, 5,618 disappeared in the form of PEN, detainees or disappeared, and that they were being held in detention camps throughout Argentina. The Montoneros tried to disrupt the World Cup soccer tournament being hosted in Argentina in '78 by launching a number of bomb attacks, and the U.S. State Department memo dated May '78 asserts, quote, "Torture has not been forsworn, and disappearances include not only suspected terrorists, but also encompass a broader range of people. For example, labor leaders, workers, clergymen, human rights advocates, scientists, doctors, and political party leaders." The report describes the torture methods used to intimidate and extract information, including electric shocks, prolonged immersion in water, cigarette burns, sexual abuse, rape, the removal of teeth and fingernails, burning with boiling water, oil, and acid, and castration. In late September 1979, Major General Luciano Benjamin Menendez tried to stage a military takeover from Cordova. He demanded that Lieutenant General Roberto Eduardo Viola's resignation, charging that the Army chief had not kept the promise to completely eradicate subversion so as to make it impossible for Marxism to make a comeback in the country in the future. And Viola sent in 4,000 paratroopers to put down the rebellion. In late '79, the Montoneros launched a strategic counteroffensive in Argentina. Among their targets was Francisco Soldati, a big banker. He was killed along with his driver at a busy downtown intersection in Buenos Aires on the morning of 6 November '79. The Montoneros leadership wrongly believed the moment was right for revolution in Argentina, but at any rate, more than 600 Argentines, the majority of them civilians, had disappeared in '78. In 1980, Adolfo Perez Esquivel, a Catholic human rights activist who had organized the Peace and Justice Service, in English, and suffered torture while held without trial for 14 months in a Buenos Aires concentration camp, was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts in the defense of human rights in Argentina. Then on the 17th of September 1980, a CIA assassin killed Anastasio Somoza, the former president of Nicaragua, in a carefully planned ambush that also killed his driver and financial advisor. You remember we discussed that a little bit when we were talking about Nicaragua. Also in 1980, after my escape from CIA-organized captivity at Lurigancho prison in Lima, Peru, I got involved in helping a young woman, Montoneros, trying to avoid execution. What little influence my family still had in the U.S. Senate, I used to assist her, and she did escape death by the skin of her teeth. I know she got back to the States, and she thanked me for the help that I had been able to get to her, because it did save her life. And after that, I lost contact with her. I've never heard from her again, and as a matter of fact, I can't even remember her name. But at any rate, this, because by that time, we'd helped so many people escape from Chile and Argentina. She was just one more. As I recall, her boyfriend got picked up in Uruguay, something like that, and he was a Montoneros. I think she was kind of along for the ride. In 1981, General Videla retired, and General Roberto Eduardo Viola replaced him, but 9 months later, Viola stepped down, allegedly for health reasons, and General Leopoldo Fortunati Galtieri took the post. In 1983, bourgeois democracy returned with Raúl Alfonsín. As we have noticed, he created the National Commission on the Disappearance of Persons, CONADEP, on the 15th of December of '83. Under Alfonsín, Congress would then pass the Ley de Punto Final and the Ley de Obediencia Debida. These are the amnesty laws. The Supreme Court then overturned these amnesty laws in June 2005, so these guys could go back on trial. The regular army soldiers fight back. Now, the Argentine war correspondent Nicholas Casalsu covered the Buenos Aires National 7th Infantry Regiment that fought in the Falklands War. When the war ended, these soldiers became Montoneros supporters. Upon returning to Argentina, they formed a vocal veterans group that repeatedly accused their officers of cowardice and maltreatment. The Alfonsín and Menem governments largely ignored them. However, they persisted and attempted to arrest and put on trial their former commanders. The Kirchners, therefore, when they came to power, supported this action. By hook and crook, the commanders managed to evade justice, but the campaign made it clear to the Argentine public that the common soldiers did not support the Gringo Condor conspiracy. Now, as for the disappeared held under PEN, on 24 March '76, the disappeared were tortured and killed under authority of the Gringo CIA-written Poder Ejecutivo Nacional, PER. The National Executive Power, PEN, would be the English translation. To date, we know that at least 5,182 were murdered outright. 18,000 had been disappeared in the form of PEN detainees by the end of '77, and over 3,000 killed in the Naval Engineering School ESMA. Some, like Senator Hipólito Solari Erogen and socialist leader Alfredo Bravo, were classified detained disappeared. Alicia Partnoy, a poet and member of the Peronist youth that had links with the Montoneros, was another of the victims who had disappeared but escaped and managed to reappear some years later. There were at least 340 concentration camps throughout Argentina, and at least 30,000 Argentines passed through these camps. A detained survivor was future President Carlos Menem, who between 1976 and 1981 had been a political prisoner. U.S. President Jimmy Carter offered to accept 3,000 Penn detainees as long as they had no terrorist background. Some 8,600 Penn disappeared, were eventually released under international pressure, and of these, 4,029 were held in illegal detention centers for less than a year, 2,300 for 1 to 3 years, 1,172 for 3 to 5 years, 668 for 5 to 7 years, 431 for 7 to 9 years, and of the detained disappeared, 157 were murdered after being released from detention. Children of these disappeared. At the time when the CONADEP report was prepared, the Asociación Abuelas de la Plaza de Mayo, Grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, had records of 172 children who disappeared. Children disappeared together with their parents or were born in one of the numerous concentration camps. The Grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo now believe up to 500 grandchildren were stolen. 102 have been located. On 13 April 2000, the Grandmothers received a tip-off that the birth certificate of Rosa Roisenblitz's infant grandson born in detention had been falsified and the child given to an Air Force officer and his wife. Following the anonymous telephone call, the child was located and he agreed to a DNA blood test. It confirmed his identity. Now, Rodolfo Fernando, grandson of Rosenblit, is the first known newborn of missing children returned to his family through the work of the Grandmothers. Rosenblit's daughter, 25-year-old Patricia Julia Rosenblit de Perez, who was active in the Montoneros, was kidnapped along with her husband, 24-year-old Jose Martinez Perez Rojo, on the 6th of October of '78. The case of Maria Eugenia Sampaio, born sometime in 1978, also received considerable attention. Sampaio sued the couple who adopted her illegally as a baby after her parents disappeared, both of whom were Montoneros. Her grandmother spent 24 years looking for her. The case was filed in 2001 after DNA tests indicated that Osvaldo Rivas and Maria Cristina Gomez were not her biological parents. They, along with Army Captain Enrique Bertier, who furnished the couple with the baby, were sentenced respectively to 8, 7, and 10 years in prison for kidnapping. The Mothers of the Playa de Mayo is the best-known Argentine human rights organization. For over 30 years, the mothers have campaigned to find out about the fate of their lost relatives. The mothers first held their vigil at the Plaza de Mayo in 1977, where they continue to gather there every Thursday afternoon. The Madres of the Plaza de Mayo monthly publication caused quite a stir in the mid-1980s, announcing its support of the human rights group Familiares. Familiares took up the cause of their children's fight as their own. It vindicates all the disappeared fighters of the people, the defeat of U.S. imperialism, and the sovereignty of the Argentine people. In addition, in 1986, the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo split into two groups. The first is called Las Madres de Plaza de Mayo Linea Fundadora, founding line. It focuses on recovering the remains of the missing and bringing former police and military commanders to trial. And the second is called the Asociación de Madres de Plaza de Mayo, the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo Association, and it refuses monetary compensation. It wants blood. In April 2004, the former head of the Mothers of Plaza, Ebe de Bonafina, declared her admiration for her missing children, Jorge Omar and Raul Alfredo, for taking up arms as left-wing guerrillas. On the 26th of January 2012, former Argentine President Eduardo Dualde criticized Ebe de Bonafini for openly supporting the Basque separatist group ETA and the Colombian left-wing FARC guerrilla movement. And then there was the Klaus Barbie affair, which we've talked about before. We talked about Bolivia. There's a movie about Nazi war criminals on Netflix, which includes one episode on Klaus Barbie that's just well worth watching. But at any rate, in 1980, the Argentine military helped Nazi war criminal Klaus Barbie, Stefano de Chie, and drug boss allies to mount the bloody cocaine coup of Luis Garcia Mesa Tejada in neighboring Bolivia. They hired 70 foreign agents for this task to man the 601st Intelligence Battalion headed by General Guillermo Suarez Mason. Well, then there was the Operation Charlie and its aftermath. The French military and the Argentine armed forces trained their counterparts in Nicaragua, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala in Operation Charlie. Then from 1977 to 1984, after the Falklands War, the Argentine armed forces exploited counterinsurgency tactics including the systemic use of torture, death squads, and disappearances. Special force units, such as the Intelligence Battalion, in English 601, headed in 1979 by Colonel Jorge Alberto Bucio, trained the Nicaraguan Contras in the 1980s at the CIA's Honduran Lepatarique base. The CIA agent responsible for operations with the Contras testified after the election of President Jimmy Carter in 1977 that the CIA had been temporarily blocked from engaging in special warfare in conformance with U.S. national security doctrine. And instead, the Argentina military took over the CIA's goals in Latin America. Many Chilean and Uruguayan exiles in Argentina were murdered by Argentine security forces, including high-profile figures such as General Carlos Prats in Buenos Aires in 1974. Then they killed Hector Gutierrez Ruiz and Selmar Michelini in Buenos Aires in 1976, and in 1981, following the election of Ronald Reagan, the CIA completely took over training of the Contras in Battalion 601. CIA documents released in 2002 show that Argentina's brutal policies were fully supported by the U.S. State Department led by Henry Kissinger under Gerald Ford's presidency. Thank God he was never a general. The Argentine military was told by Kissinger et al. That the U.S. approved of the dirty war. And in fact, the U.S. directed the entire junta operation in Argentina. Despite the fact that at least 6 U.S. citizens had been disappeared by the Argentine military, by 1976, high-ranking State Department officials, including then Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, secretly gave their approval to Argentina's new military rulers. The Nation magazine published in October 1987 an expose written by Martine Edwin Anderson, a Washington Post and Newsweek special correspondent, that Kissinger had secretly given the junta dirty warriors a green light for their state terrorist policies. Upon finding out that Kissinger had given the Argentine generals a green light for their so-called dirty war in June 1976, while he was at an Organization of American States meeting in Santiago at the Hotel Carrera, later made famous as the Hotel Cabrera in the chilling movie Missing, Robert C. Hill quietly tried to cover up the Kissinger decision. Now, meanwhile, a right-wing Argentine death squad has attempted to assassinate both the U.S. envoy, that is the ambassador, Robert Hill, and his family members in Buenos Aires, believing that he had not done enough. During a meeting with Argentinian Foreign Minister Cesar Augusto Gussetti, Kissinger assured him that the United States was an ally, but urged him to, quote, appear to get back to normal procedures, unquote, quickly, before the U.S. Congress reconvened and had a chance to consider sanctions. The 1987 Nation article asserted, quote, Hill was shaken and became very disturbed by the case of the son of a 30-year-old U.S. Embassy employee who was arrested and never seen again. According to New York Times reporter Juan de Onís, Hill took a personal interest. He went to the Interior Minister, an Army general with whom he had worked on drug cases, saying, hey, what about this? We're interested in this case. He buttonholed Argentine Foreign Minister Cesar Gussetti and finally Argentine President Jorge R. Videla himself. All he got was stonewalling. He got nowhere, de Onís said. But for this, Hill was placed on the kill list of the Argentine fascist regime, which is quite a bit to put a U.S. ambassador on your kill list. Hill's last year featured his increasing disillusionment, dismay, and outright fear. He believed he and his family were on the hit list. Patricia Darien, the Mississippi civil rights crusader who became President Jimmy Carter's State Department point person on human rights, said after Hill reported to her Kissinger's real role, quote, that with an imperial wave of his hand, an American could sentence people to death on the basis of a cheap whim. As time went on, I saw Kissinger's footprints in a lot of countries. It was the repression of a democratic ideal, unquote. In 1978, former Secretary Kissinger, however, was feted by the dirty war generals as a much-touted guest of honor while he was attending the World Cup soccer matches held in Argentina. You know, I can't believe that Kissinger is such a sports fan that he went to that World Cup soccer match in Argentina to watch the soccer. I think he was there specifically to talk to the junta generals that he was supporting, but at any rate, that's just my opinion. What we do know is that Mr. Hill, the ambassador, was thrown under the bus posthumously. Kissinger wrote to the Nation editor, Victor Novoski, protesting publication of the 1987 article, claiming that, quote, at any rate, the notion of Hill as a passionate human rights advocate is new to all his former associates, unquote. Ironically, Kissinger's posthumous lampooning of Hill, who had mysteriously died in 1978 as human rights advocate, was later shown to be false, and that by none other than once and future Kissinger aide Harry Schlotterman. Then I have a little section here I call My Old Friend Harry Schlotterman. Schlotterman was a career CIA agent in the State Department and later ambassador to Buenos Aires and Lima, Peru, when I was there. Now, Schlotterman told William E. Knight, an oral historian working for the Association for Diplomatic Studies and Training, ADST, Foreign Affairs Oral History Project, the following. He says, it really came, and that is Schlotterman says, it really came to a head when I was Assistant Secretary of State, where it began to come to a head in the case of Argentina, where the dirty war was in full flower. Bob Hill, his ambassador to Argentina, who was ambassador then in Buenos Aires, a very conservative Republican politician, by no means liberal or anything of the kind, began to report quite effectively about what was going on, this slaughter of innocent civilians, this vicious war that the Argentine government was conducting, that is the secret underground war. Hill at one time, in fact, sent me a back-channel telegram saying that the Argentine foreign minister, who had just come for a visit to Washington and returned to Buenos Aires, had gloated to him that Kissinger had said nothing to him about human rights. Schlotterman goes on to say, I don't know myself as I wasn't present at the interview, unquote. Schlotterman knows everything, knew everything about what was going on in Washington. And I frequently had him between a rock and a hard place because Frank Church kept investigating his operations. Frank Church, the senator from my state, Idaho, kept investigating his operations as long as they had me in prison down there. On the 7th of August 1979, U.S. Embassy in Argentina sent a secret memorandum of their agent's conversation with Jorge Contreras, director of Task Force 7 of the Reunion Central, section of the 601 Army Intelligence Unit. This task force gathered members from all parts of the Argentine Armed Forces. The subject of the memo was nuts and bolts of the government's repression of terrorism subversion, and the original document is in the website of the National Security Archive. Now that's a private organization, it's not a federal organization, so at least you can get some reliable information from them. As a rule of thumb, you can't believe anything that the U.S. government publishes officially because almost always it's a pack of lies, unless of course they're reporting the number of trees in a forest someplace or whatever, but if it's political you can be sure it's not true. And therefore you want to go to another source. This National Security Archives is one outfit that keeps a close track on how many State Department lies are out there. State Department documents obtained in 2003 during the George W. Bush administration by the National Security Archive under the Freedom of Information Act show that in October '76, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and high-ranking U.S. officials gave their full support to the Argentine military junta and urged them to hurry up and finish their actions before the U.S. Congress cut military aid. Then on the 5th of October 76, Kissinger met with Argentina's foreign minister and stated, quote, "Look, our basic attitude is that we would like you to succeed. I have an old-fashioned view that friends ought to be supported. What is not understood in the United States is that you have a civil war. We read about human rights problems, but not the context. The quicker you succeed, the better. The human rights problem is a growing one. Your ambassador can apprise you. We want a stable situation. We won't cause you unnecessary difficulties. If you can finish this up before Congress gets back, the better. Whatever freedoms you could restore would help." Unquote. At any rate, that's Kissinger talking to the Argentine foreign minister. The U.S. was also an essential provider of economic and military assistance to the Videla regime during the earliest and most intense phase of the repression. In early April 76, the U.S. Congress approved a request by the Ford administration, written supported by Henry Kissinger, to grant $50 million in security assistance to the junta. Of course, this was a bribe that went directly into the pockets of the generals and admirals, kind of like the way they do it in the Ukraine. And you can believe that in the Ukraine, as long as the U.S. keeps sending those airplanes full of shrink-wrapped $100 bills by the ton, that there'll be Poroshenko, Yats, and the rest of them out there getting in line to grab as much as they can carry away and send off to their Swiss bank accounts. And the same thing was true. This has been going on for all of my lifetime, and of course that's what that $50 million went to. At the end of the 76, Congress granted an initial bribe of $30 million and recommendations by the Ford administration to increase military aid to $63.5 million. U.S. assistance, training, and military sales to the Videla regime alone continued under the successive Carter administration up until at least the 30th of September of 78, when military aid was officially called to a stop by complying with Section 502B of the Foreign Assistance Act. In 77 and 78, the U.S. gave more than $120 million in military spare parts to Argentina. This is another bribe. What happens is, if that equipment actually arrives, and frequently what arrives is the money, and of course it goes straight into the pockets of the junta. If that equipment actually arrives, they sell it on the international market. Well, they can sell it for cheap and easy, 50% of what its value is. It's kind of like a mafia operation where you wipe out a restaurant, but first before you burn it down, you have it run up as credit with everybody in town on this liquor and food and so on. At any rate, in 1977, the U.S. Department of Defense gave $700,000 to train 217 Argentine military officers. They admit to that. The International Military Education and Training Program was suspended, however, in 1978, so total U.S. training costs for Argentina military personnel after 76 totaled $1,115,000. The Reagan administration, beginning in 81, asserted that the previous Carter administration had weakened U.S. diplomatic relationships with Cold War allies in Argentina. Accordingly, the GIPR reversed the previous administration's official condemnation of the junta's human rights practices and said that actually what the junta was doing was just fine. The reestablishment of diplomatic ties allowed for CIA collaboration with Argentine intelligence service in training and arming the Nicaraguan Contras against the Sandinista government, and the 601 Intelligence Battalion, for example, trained Contras at the U.S. Patarrique base in Honduras. Now, Cuba, the rebel base, did not just sit back and watch all of this. Cuba helped the guerrillas fight back. In 72, Argentine cops planted a bomb in the Sheraton Hotel in Buenos Aires that killed a Canadian tourist and blamed it on the FAR, that is the Armed Revolutionary Forces. That was a guerrilla group in Argentina. During the height of the Argentine state terrorism, the Cubans used their embassy in Buenos Aires to maintain contact with Argentine guerrillas. In 1973, the Montoneros merged with the Cuban-backed FAR. On the 13th of February 74, a clandestine meeting was held in Mendoza, Argentina. You remember, we've talked about that several times. That's the, if you go on a straight line railroad from Buenos Aires to the Andes, you go to Mendoza, and from there you cross over into Chile and come out on the right in front of Santiago. At any rate, on the 13th of February, this meeting was arranged by the Cuban Secret Service and in Mendoza, and the Junta de Coordinación Revolucionaria, that is JCR, or JCR, or Junta of Revolutionary Coordination, was formed. The JCR consisted of 4 guerrilla groups: the Uruguayan Tupamaros, the Chilean Movement of the Revolutionary Left, the Bolivian Revolutionary Army, and the ERP guerrillas. And in the text I give you the Spanish names too, but at any rate, the ERP entered this JCR with a guerrilla warfare training school, an arms factory, a false documentation center, all located in Argentina. However, in 1975, the Argentine security forces liquidated most of these. So in 1976, ERP guerrillas moved their training to Cuba, where the DGI, the General Direction of Intelligence, had an estate near Guanabo and another facility in Pilar del Rio. Now, the French connection. Investigating French military influence in Argentina in 2003, French journalist Marie-Monique Robin found the original document proving that a 1959 agreement between Paris and Buenos Aires initiated a permanent French military mission in Argentina. We've talked about her before, especially when we had our lectures on Operation Condor, but I'll go over this again here because it's important. She found the document in the archives of the French Foreign Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This military mission was made up of veterans who had fought in the Algerian War. This permanent French military mission was assigned to the offices of the Chief of Staff of the Argentine Armed Forces. It was abolished after the 1981 election of Social Democrat François Mitterrand. In August 2003 of Robin's documentary film Death Squads, the French School, is the English translation, was released. She then wrote about it in the Communist Party of France's daily L'Humanité newspaper. She said, among other things, quote, "The French have systematized a military technique in urban environment which would be copied and pasted to Latin American dictatorships." She noted that the French military had systematized the methods they used to suppress the insurgency during the 1957 Battle of Algiers and exported them to the war school in Buenos Aires. She said Roger Trinquier's famous book on counterinsurgency had a very strong influence in South America. In addition, Robin said she was shocked to learn that the DST, the French intelligence agency, gave DINA, D-I-N-A, that's the Chilean Secret Service, the names of refugees who returned to Chile in Operation Retorno from France during their counterinsurgency, and all of these Chileans were murdered. Quote, "Of course, this makes the French government responsible, and specifically Giscard d'Estaing, then President of the Republic. I was very shocked by the duplicity of the French diplomatic position, which on the one hand received with open arms the political refugees, and on the other hand collaborated with the dictatorships." In response, on 10 September 2003, Green Party members of the French Parliament, Noël Mamère, Martine Millard, and Yves Cochet, filed a request to form a parliamentary commission to examine the role of France in the support of military regimes in Latin America from 1973 to 1984. The request was filed with the Foreign Affairs Commission of the National Assembly, presided over at that time by Edouard Balladur of the UMP party. Apart from Le Monde, French-capped newspapers did not report this request. UMP deputy in Parliament Roland Blum, who was in charge of the commission, refused to let Marie-Monique Robin testify. The commission in December 2003 published a 12-page report that was an outright lie, claiming that the French had never signed a military agreement with Argentina. When Minister of Foreign Affairs Dominique de Villepin traveled to Chile in February 2003, he furthered the lie, saying that no cooperation between France and the military regimes had occurred. People in Argentina were outraged when they saw the 2003 film which included 3 generals defending their actions during the Dirty War. Due to public pressure, President Nestor Kirchner ordered the military to bring charges against these 3 for justifying the crimes of the dictatorship. The 3 Dirty War criminals named were Albano Arguinigai, Reinaldo Bignone, and Ramon Genaro Diaz Besone. The next year, Robin published her book under the same title, Esquadrons de la Mort, Death Squad's the French School, revealing more material. She showed how Valery Giscard d'Estaing's government secretly collaborated with Fidelis Junta in Argentina and with Augusto Pinochet's regime in Chile. Alcides López Alfranc was among the first Argentine officers to go in 1957 to Paris to study for 2 years at the École de Guerre military school, 2 years before the Cuban Revolution, and when no Argentine guerrillas existed. In practice, declared Robin to Página 12, that's a newspaper, the arrival of the French in Argentina led to a massive extension of intelligence services and of the use of torture as the primary weapon of the anti-subversive war in the concept of modern warfare. The annihilation decree signed by Isabel Perón had been inspired by French texts during the Battle of Algiers. The police forces were put under the authority of the army. 30,000 persons were disappeared. In Algeria alone, Reinaldo Bignone, named president of the Argentine junta in July '82, said in Robin's film, "The March '76 order of battle is an exact copy of the Algerian battle. Generals Albanar Arguindegui, Videla's interior minister, and Diaz Besone, former minister of planification and ideology of the junta, made the same statements. The French military would transmit to their Argentine counterparts the notion of an internal enemy and the use of torture death squads and quadrillages or grids." This brings us to the matter of Paul Schaefer in Colonia Dignidad. Schaefer was born in Troisdorf, Germany, and joined the Hitler Youth movement at a young age. He served as a medic in the Wehrmacht during World War II, where he reached the rank of corporal. Following the war, he set up a children's home and Baptist ministry. In 1959, he created the Private Social Mission, purportedly a charitable organization. That same year, he was charged with sexually abusing 2 children and fled West Germany with some of his followers, and they went to Chile. Schaefer followed the teachings of the American preacher William M. Branham, one of the founders of the post-World War II healing revival. Branham advocated a strict adherence to the Bible, a woman's duty to her husband, and apocalyptic visions such as Los Angeles sinking beneath the ocean. Schaefer resurfaced in Chile in 1961, where the government at the time, led by the conservative President Jorge Alessandri, granted him permission to create the Dignidad Beneficent Society on a farm outside of the Chilean town of Parral. Founded primarily on Baptist principles and anti-communism, this society evolved into the Colonia Dignidad community. Schaefer disappeared on 20 May '77, fleeing child sex abuse charges, this time filed by Chilean authorities under Christian Democrat President Eduardo Frei Ruiz Tagle. After 26 children who went to the commune's free clinic and school reported abuse, he was tried in Chile in his absence and found guilty in late 2004. Schaefer was found on March 10, 2005, nearly 8 years after his disappearance, hiding in a suburb known as Las Acacias, 24 miles from Buenos Aires, Argentina. Following 2 days of negotiations between Chilean and Argentine authorities, Schaefer was sent back to Chile to face a court hearing. There he was charged in being involved with the 1976 disappearance of a political activist, Juan Maino, and he remained in custody until his death. Schaefer was also under investigation in Chile in connection with the disappearance of Boris Weisweiler, crimes against humanity, and was wanted in Germany and France in connection with earlier child abuse allegations. On the 24th of May 2006, Schaefer was sentenced to 20 years in jail for sexually abusing 25 children in order to pay $1.5 million to 11 minors whose representatives established suits. Schaefer was found guilty of 20 counts of dishonest abuses, 5 counts of child rape, all committed between 93 and 97. Well, when he resurfaced in Chile, it was President Jorge Alessandri who granted him permission to create the Dignidad Beneficent Society. Now, Schaefer disappeared on the 20th of May again. As we've gone through this whole thing, I won't have to go over that again. He died finally on the 24th of April 2010 in custody in Santiago de Chile's penitentiary hospital due to a heart failure. He was 88 years old, they said. The New York Times said he was 89 years old. And their article says a former Nazi-era German soldier who founded a secretive German cult in southern Chile, where he sexually abused about 25 children, died of heart failure at a prison hospital early Saturday. Chilean officials said he was 89. Now, if you watch this movie Colonia, it's on Netflix right now, and it's in English. What the star is the guy that starred in the movie, the girl with the dragon tattoo. At any rate, you'll know that there was a lot more than 25 children involved. There were hundreds, maybe thousands, that were kept at this place. The former soldier Paul Schaefer, they said, was serving a 20-year sentence for the sexual abuse of minors, but he was also under investigation for the '85 disappearance of Boris Weisfeller, a U.S. citizen who vanished while on a hiking trip. And of course, you know, he's dead. The Chilean government said officially that Mr. Weisfeller, then 43 years old, drowned while trying to ford a river, but State Department and CIA reports that were later declassified indicated that he was kidnapped by Chilean state security forces who handed him over to Mr. Schaefer's heavily armed Colonia Dignidad religious sect based nearby. You'll see exactly that kind of thing happen to a German citizen in that movie Colonia. Dozens of opponents of General Augusto Pinochet's dictatorship were tortured at Colonia Dignidad, according to the human rights group. One military informant said that Mr. Weisfeller, a Russian-born Jew, was held captive there, and that he was later tortured and executed. A former nurse from the Luftwaffe, Mr. Schaefer, was forced to leave Germany after he was charged with sexually abusing young boys in an orphanage he ran there. In 1961, he founded Colonia Dignidad, an anti-Semite apocalyptic religious sect about 225 miles south of Santiago. Early in the last decade, it still had about 300 inhabitants, and it still exists. It is now referred to as Villa Baviera, or Villa Baviera. Mr. Schaefer ran the sect with a heavy hand, banning almost all contact with the outside world, separating women from men and children from their parents, and controlling intimate contact. While he was never a hunted Nazi, Mr. Schaefer opened Colonia Dignidad for fugitive Nazis to hide out for extended periods of time. After Chile's courts began investigating Mr. Schaefer for sexual abuse charges in the late 90s, he fled to Argentina, where he hid until he was found in 2005, and after being returned to Chile, was sentenced to 20 years in prison for sexually abusing 25 children. Mr. Schaefer was also sentenced to 3 years for violating weapons control law after a huge military arsenal was found on Colonia Dignidad grounds, and to 7 years for homicide and 3 years for torture. The disappearance of Mr. Weisfeller, who was a mathematics professor at Penn State University, continues to be an unsolved mystery, and Mr. Schaefer was never officially charged in the case. Of course, for Mr. Weisfeller, who's dead, I guess it's kind of irrelevant. Sebastian Pinera, Chile's president, said Saturday that, well, Mr. Schaefer now cannot be judged in court for additional crimes he was suspected of. There is another justice that never ends, which is divine justice. Well, at any rate, as I say, that movie was directed by Florian Gallenberger, produced by Benjamin Herman, written by, well, you got all these figures in there, but it stars Michael Nyquist, the fellow from The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, Emma Watson, Daniel Bruhl, and it has an all-star cast and so on and so forth. 110 minutes long, and you can watch it on Netflix. Colonia, also known as The Colony, is a 2015 historical romantic thriller film directed by Oscar winner Florian Gallenberger, produced by Benjamin Herman, written by Torsten Wenzel and Gallenberger, starring Emma Watson, Daniel Bruhl, and Michael Nyquist. The film is set against the backdrop of the Chilean military coup and the real Colonia Dignidad, the notorious cult in the south of China, led by German lay preacher Paul Schaefer. Well, Schaefer and his crackpot Protestant sect were not alone. There was a lot of Catholic complicity here too. Monique Robin also demonstrated that since the 1930s there had been ties between the French far right and Argentina, as we have seen, in particular through the Catholic fundamentalist organization Cité Catholique. Catholique Cité was created by Jacques Osset, a former secretary of Charles Maurras, the founder of the Royalist Action French movement, and it edited a review called La Verbe, which influenced militaries during the Algerian War, notably by justifying the use of torture. At the end of the 1950s, Cité Catholique founded groups in Argentina and organized cells in the army. It greatly expanded during the government of General Juan Carlos Onganía, in particular in 1969. The key figure of that period was General Juan Carlos Onganía, and his biggest supporter was this guy, Georges Grasset, who was actually Videla's personal Catholic priest confessor. Grasset had been the spiritual guide of the OAS. I'll just give you the English names. The Secret Army Organization, pro-French Algeria terrorist movement founded in Frankish Spain. It became worldwide infamous for its many plots to assassinate Charles de Gaulle, inspiring the movie Day of the Jackal. Robin believes that this Catholic fundamentalist current in the Argentine army contributed to the importance and length of the French-Argentine cooperation. In Buenos Aires, Georges Grasset maintained links with Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, founder of the Society of St. Pius X in 1970, who himself was excommunicated, the Archbishop that is, in 1988. The Society had been the principal agent of the fascist Pope Pius X. This society had 4 monasteries in Argentina, the largest one in La Reja. A French priest from there said to Marie Monique Robin, quote, "To save the soul of a communist priest, one must first kill him," unquote. Dominique Lagneau, the priest in charge of the monastery, presented Luis Roldan, former Undersecretary of Cult under Carlos Menem, President of Argentina from 89 to 99, to Robin as Mr. Petit Catholique in Argentina. Bruno Ginta and Juan Carlos Goyeneche represent this ideology. Antonio Caggiano, Archbishop of Buenos Aires from 59 to 75, wrote a prologue to Jean Usset's 1961 Spanish version of Marxism-Leninism. Caggiano said, "Marxism is the negation of Christ and his church," and referred to a Marxist conspiracy to take over the world, for which it was necessary to prepare for this decisive battle. Together with President Arturo Frondizi, the Radical Civic Union UCR, Caggiano inaugurated the first course on counter-revolutionary warfare in the Higher Military College. Frondizi was eventually overthrown for being, quote, "tolerant of communism," unquote. By 1963, cadets at the Navy Mechanics School, ESMA, started receiving counterinsurgency classes. They were shown the film The Battle of Algiers, which showed the methods used by the French army in Algeria. Caggiano, the military chaplain at the time, introduced the film and added a religiously oriented commentary to it. On 2 July 1966, 4 days after President Arturo Umberto Illia was removed from office and replaced by the dictator Juan Carlos Onganía, Caggiano then declared, "We are at a sort of dawn in which, thanks to God, we all sense that the country is again headed for greatness." Argentine Admiral Luis Maria Mendia, who had started the practice of death flights, testified in January 2007 before Argentine judges that a French intelligence agent, Bertrand de Perceval, had participated in the abduction of two French nuns, Léonie Desquette and Alice Dumont. Perceval lives today in Thailand and admitted being a former member of the OAS and having escaped from Argentina after the March 62 Evian Accords put an end to the Algerian War of 54 to 62, for which the OAS had declared eternal war against Charles de Gaulle. During the 2007 hearings, Luis Maria Mendia referred to a material presented in Robin's documentary titled The Death Squads, the French School, in 2003. He asked the Argentine court to call numerous French officials to testify to their actions. Subpoenaed were former French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, former French Premier Pierre Mesmer, former French Ambassador to Buenos Aires, François de la Gosse, and all officials in place in the French Embassy in Buenos Aires between 76 and 83. Besides this French connection, Maria Mendia also charged former head of state Isabel Perón and former ministers Carlos Ucaf and Antonio Cafiera, who had signed the anti-subversion decrees before Videla's 76 coup d'etat. Mendia was trying to establish that these crimes were legitimate, as the 1987 Obediencia Debida Act claimed them to be. Further, that the ESMA actions had been committed under Isabel Perón's anti-subversion decrees, which would give them a formal appearance of legality, although torture is forbidden by the Argentine Constitution. Alfredo Astiz also referred to the French connection when testifying in court. When I was doing research for this, I couldn't help but remember that in Peru it was routine for all of our guys, all of the U.S. citizens that got arrested, to be tortured and forced to sign a confession. But the most interesting part of this wasn't that, but when you get to the juzgado, to the investigating judge, first question he asks you is, were you tortured to sign this statement? Of course, everybody said yes. He said, well, I will have to throw it out. So they can't even use that in the court. And what that does in effect is they send you now as a detainee for further investigation. And in the time I got there, this could take several years. So none of the Americans that were out there, the U.S. citizens, I mean, had ever had a trial. Well, we changed all of that, but the point is that the real function here is to give you time to come up with the money to pay the judges on the tribunal for your release. And what they give you an opinion. Let's say that the average guy got an opinion in those days that he should do 2 years in prison. Well, what this really means is you're going to sit out there for 2 years while they conduct a so-called investigation. Then you come up with the money to pay the 3 judges, which at that time was about $6,000, and then they'll release you, as your 2-year sentence is over anyway. Your 2-year opinion. So I'm sure that much of the same thing was happening here, but at any rate, those are just little humorous asides based on my own personal experiences. The junta relinquished power in 1983 after democratic elections, and President-elect Raúl Alfonsín created the National Commission on the Disappearance of Persons, or CONADEP, as we've seen, in December 83, and appointed to lead it was the writer Ernesto Sabato, well known down there, and he was charged with collecting evidence about the dirty war crimes. The gruesome details, including documentation of the disappearance of nearly 9,000 people, shocked the world. Jorge Rafael Videla, head of the junta, was among the generals convicted of crimes against humanity, including forced disappearances, torture, murders, and kidnappings. President Alfonsín ordered that the 9 members of the military junta be judicially charged, and during the 1985 trial of the juntas, together with some guerrilla leaders, well, I won't go through those names, they won't mean anything to you, but at any rate, in 1985, Videla was sentenced to life imprisonment at the military prison of Magdalena. Several senior officers also received jail terms, and as of 2010, most of the military officials were in prison or on trial. Now, what about the economic crisis of Argentina during these years? Between 1975 and 1990, real per capita income fell by more than 20%, wiping out almost 3 decades of economic development. The manufacturing industry, which had experienced a period of uninterrupted growth under Peronism until the mid-1970s, began a process of continuous decline. As usual, the neoliberal hitmen of U.S. imperialism insisted on withdrawal of state support of national capitalist industries, and this caused a sharp fall of industrial output. The degree of autochthonous industrialization at the start of the 90s was similar to the level of the 1940s before the first military government of the United Officers. If you've seen the movie Evita, that first military government of the United Officers is where they show the first of the military coups. Colonel Perón was part of it, and eventually, of course, well, anyway, that's what they're talking about. So the industrial development that Argentina had by 1991-95 was about the same as it had been in 1945. Or I think that coup was in 43, say 1943. So even so, in the early 70s, per capita income in Argentina had been twice as high as in Mexico, and more than 3 times as high as in Chile and Brazil. After the sellout to the gringo economic hitmen, the difference in income between Argentina and the other Latin American countries was much smaller, so that by 1990, U.S. banks and corporations had destroyed all the advances of the national bourgeoisie under Perón and his immediate successors. Starting with the Rodrigazo, in 1975, there was a sharply accelerated period of inflation that reached an average of more than 300% per year during the 75 to 91 period. Inflation always does one thing. It takes money out of the pockets of workers because prices increase much more rapidly than wages. So it's just another cap trick to inflation like this. You wouldn't have a 300% a year inflation rate if the government didn't want it, would you? So this is what you have. This is a standard way everywhere of decreasing wages for workers. Well, prices increased during this period by an aggregate of $20 billion and led to several denominations of the Argentine currency. When Martinez de Hoz assumed power as finance minister, prices in the previous month had increased at an annual rate of 5,000%, and output had declined sharply. In 1970, as you can imagine, if your prices are now 5,000% higher than they were last month, not very many people are going to, whose wages are the same as last month, are going to be able to buy that stuff. So your capitalist production is going to have to stop. There's no point in producing something you can't sell it. In 1976, the era of import substitution ended. The government lowered import barriers, opening the banking system to foreign borrowing, sabotaging the peso against foreign currencies. This opening meant that domestic firms could not compete with foreign imports. The financial reform that had been implemented had opened capital markets to U.S. banks. After 76-78, the fiscal deficit started to climb again due to payments to U.S. corporations and banks. In other words, you could run a fiscal deficit, that is the deficit in your budget, for a variety of reasons. One good reason might be if you had a bunch of social programs putting a lot of people to work, because that's money that goes right back into the economy. But paying foreign banks doesn't do anything for your economy. The external debt tripled in 3 years, and this increased debt burden interrupted industrial development and upward social mobility, to say the least. Beginning in 79, the rate of exchange depreciation was fixed with a tablita. Now, the tablita was an active crawling peg based on a timetable that announced ahead of time a gradually declining rate of depreciation. And these announcements were repeated on a rolling basis to create an environment where purchasing and selling agents could discern a government commitment to deflation. Inflation responded to this policy and gradually fell through 1980 to below 100%. Nevertheless, gradually during the 78-79 period, the real exchange rate appreciated because inflation consistently outpaced the rate of depreciation, and the overvaluation ultimately led to capital flight and collapse of the financial system. which occurred first with the failure of Banco de Intercambio Regional, the regional interchange bank, in March of 1980. That led to runs on other banks. Labor fought back and got increased government spending and some wage raises, but capitalists refused to reinvest capital in new equipment, and the resulting inefficient production contributed to a chronic inflation that rose through the 1980s. At one time, it exceeded an annual rate of 1,000%. Successive governments tried to control inflation through wage and price controls, cuts in public spending, and restrictions of the money supply. However, wage freezes meant workers could never catch up to the cap-imposed inflation. Then in 1982, the Argentine fascist regime tried to deflect the inevitable class conflict by starting a war with the United Kingdom over the Falkland Islands. In August '82, after Mexico had announced its inability to service its debt, the fascist regime in Argentina approached the International Monetary Fund for financial assistance. This gave the gringo regime in the north the opening it had wanted. An IMF team was sent to Buenos Aires in August '83. For assistance, it demanded wage freezes and reductions, and an end to social assistance program, as well as an end to regulations of any kind on external competitiveness. The IMF program was designed to fail. As it did, the peso quickly lost its remaining value to inflation. A new peso was introduced in 1983, with 10,000 old pesos exchanged for each new peso. In December '83, Raúl Alfonsín was elected president of Argentina, bringing to an end the military dictatorship. Under Alfonsín, negotiations started on a new program with the IMF, but that led to nothing. In March of '84, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, and Venezuela lent Argentina $300 million for 3 months, because this was guaranteed by the U.S. government, which then officially followed with a similar amount. It was not before late September '84 that an agreement was reached between the IMF and Argentina. At the same time, the gringo banks were taking over the Mexican economy. In 1985, the currency was redenominated again, with the Austral substituting the discredited peso. In '86, Argentina failed to pay the debt for several months until ultimately the debt was renegotiated with the creditor banks. During '86 and '87, the Austral plan faded away. Argentina's new, more socially responsible government fell out of compliance with the IMF program. Another IMF arrangement was reached in July but collapsed in March of '88. July of '87, collapsed in March of '88. The next move by the authorities was to launch the Plan Primavera in August '88, consisting of a package of economically heterodox measures that foresaw little fiscal adjustment, but this time the IMF refused to resume lending to Argentina under any circumstances, and 6 months after its introduction, the Plan Primavera collapsed, leading to hyperinflation and riots. Well, this lecture's gone on quite a long time, and we still have to cover the Kirchners and the mockery business, so I think what we're going to do is continue that in a second lecture. So this is 45A. There'll be a 45B sometime in the not-too-distant future. And there was something else I was going to add to this, and I forgot what it was, but I guess that's enough for now.